So, having had to follow Sarko before, it's always difficult because I think he's brilliant. I really do. And I think it's worth just reflecting on that for a moment, because not only does he have that lived experience, but he's also a qualified therapist, right? That's what took him in that meeting with Rick Doblin. And I think we can allow ourselves to pay attention to his conclusions. Now, I'm really pleased that we have our police trainers back on this panel to discuss it further. We've also got Jason, who's a former chief, so that's going to be an ideal perspective. And Chris, who he wouldn't like me to describe him this way, but he is an absolute expert on this topic. He's working on this every day with great enthusiasm, but he also knows the mind of Sarko, so he can quite confidently answer how Sarko might have done. So what I sort of envisaged this last panel to be was a sort of look to the future. Like, okay, we've listened to the problems, we've listened to the evidence and the importance of meaningfulness, and most importantly, we've repeatedly emphasised the scale of the problem. And I think we can agree that there is not only a significant problem now, but also clear indications that problem is going to get worse. Now, I sort of thought we would perhaps start with looking at with the kind of work that's going on at the University of Law and also the University of Salford with teaching cops. How can we can expand on some of the philosophical thinking and how actually bring that into the workplace. But I think I was going to lead into the psychedelic point later, but I think we're going to have to follow the thread, aren't we? Because I think it just occurred to me listening to Sarko speaking now, I'm used to it, I'm used to thinking these terms. But there's going to be police officers listening to this online, and they're going to be saying, "What? Look, say that again." This is slightly out of the box for a lot of police officers we're going to be talking to, and even talking about using MDMA or psychedelics as therapy for police officers seems astonishing. But actually, what's just been suggested there is a step way beyond that, actually. Because we're talking about actually looking after the wellness of police officers and preventing their descent into mental illness, which of course is appealing because of all the problems that we've highlighted so far about retaining police officers, the political risk of the impact on public confidence and all of those kind of things. So, first of all, I'm just going to turn to you, Chris, because I think we can clarify a couple of the things from the conversation with Sarko. Just give me one item of another piece of evidence. How strong is the evidence for these new innovative treatments, in addition to what we've just heard from Sarko?
So I think Sarko mentioned the phase 2 trial. So I mean, I guess maybe we're a little bit more au fait with the clinical trial process than we were post-pandemic. So we know about, you've got to go through a phase 3 trial where you do placebo control. So you have people who get it, people who don't get it. And then you determine based on that, what's the difference? Does it work? Does it work, basically? Now, we can get into the issues of actually, it's pretty difficult to do a placebo-controlled trial with a psychedelic substance because you know whether you've had it or not. So that is an issue. As far as the science is concerned, but one would argue that actually maybe that doesn't make such a difference because the effect is so powerful that whether you know whether you've got it or not is not really affecting the outcome. The drug itself is having the impact anyway. But so they have moved from those phase 2 trials to do 2 phase 3 trials, which is the final stage. And on those phase 3 trials, specifically the first phase 3 trial, which are the most difficult people, deliberately the most difficult people, treatment-resistant, dissociative subtype, comorbidities of alcohol abuse, specifically with MDMA therapy and psychedelics more broadly. And we could get into the whole disorder model of psychiatry and trauma and things. We talked a lot about trauma here. But specifically also people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, and that might not be the majority of police officers, but there will be police officers who will go into the police because of that, because of what happened to them, because either there might be a negative reason for that, but also be a positive reason, because they want to do something, they want to seek to help. I mean, a lot of therapists, I know quite a lot of therapists, a lot of those people go into therapy because they want to help. So it's probably, you might find a slightly higher proportion in those kind of helping professions and jobs than there are in the general population. And it's those people that are specifically treatment resistant because they themselves, they have to narrow their focus around how they feel because there's so much loaded in. So that affects their self-compassion. And most trauma therapies are predicated on the idea that you can actually bring the trauma forward and tolerate it more. And actually, if you've had adverse childhood experiences, you don't have that capability. So it's basically this idea of self-expression. So you can't express, you can't hold that. There's no way you can do it. And in the phase 3 trials that they did, so the placebo condition is actually therapy. So it's a very intense therapy program. And actually, interestingly, they actually have quite good efficacy even with the intense therapy program. But the people who have adverse childhood experiences, it doesn't work for them. It just doesn't work because they cannot bring it forward. So that's where MDMA therapy is particularly appropriate. It's for people for who they just cannot bring this forward because it actually creates the space and it softens so you can actually bring this forward. And so 2 phase 3 trials, 67% of people lose their diagnosis, so they no longer have a diagnosis of PTSD. The second phase 3 trial, 70%. That's the most effective therapy that there is. There's never been a scientific trial that's been that effective with that level of treatment-resistant depression. So that's really where we are with the science. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, Chris. We needed to just have that further detail of actually the kind of impacts that we're talking about.
And just to add to that, so I mentioned to Sarko about where we are in the US. In the US, kind of expedited this, and it looks like they're going to approve in this year, October. Australia already has given an approval for MDMA therapy for PTSD, so they've already accepted that the evidence is there. They don't need any more evidence. So the UK is in a position. One of the benefits of Brexit, I'm not going to talk any more about that, is actually that we have a separate approval process for medicines. So one of the things they did is they have an expedited approval process. So that actually means that if something gets approved based on the evidence in the FDA, for example, there don't need to be a separate set of clinical trials in this country. They can accept the evidence. So there's an opportunity in this country to actually have expedited approval for these therapies. And so that's just something to bear in mind, that the UK and people who need it, police officers and retired police officers and other emergency service workers, as well as people who suffer sexual abuse and childhood trauma, these people are suffering with no treatment, and we've got an opportunity to bring that forward.
Fabulous, thank you, Chris. If you pass it to Jason, please. I've got 2 questions here, Jason. First of all, you've been in the police leadership position, so you've experienced these frustrations about retention and all of the mental health crises and actually dealing with traumatised cops and trying to look after them. But I know you as a fairly forward-thinking guy, well informed in all of these topics. Do you think that's the case with other chiefs? And do you think that there is an organisational appetite for innovation, such as we've been hearing? That's the first thing. And how quickly do you think we need to be designing the systems for police officers, and how do you think that might work? Now that's a big question. Shorten it. Feel free to shorten it if you need to.
So the first one.
Oh.
So the first one, I think we've got to remember that every chief constable has got both a legal and moral responsibility for looking after their people, and that's not just when they're in the service, but also when they're outside the service as well. Some do that better than others. Some are very good, some are not very good. Which is then the next point of that first question, because you have some there that will show more compassion and probably courage, being willing to try new things. And at the same time, though, I think the issue comes back to you've got 43 different views potentially, and therefore you get the postcode lottery, which again can't be right for policing. So it goes back to my point earlier on about evidence base. If the evidence shows it can make a difference, going back to the legal and moral duty to look after our people, and the fact is by getting the right people, by the regulation done so it can be done, actually there's no reason why this couldn't happen quickly. The issue goes back to, again, is that public perception of what's being done, why it's being done, and again, having a consistent message within policing from all chiefs saying this is why we're doing it. The big for me goes back to consistency though. We can't have one chief being willing to do this, or one area doing it, and the others are not. because again, that's not fair on the individuals, and it's not fair on the wider community as well.
Yeah, great answer. Now, because of all the reasons that we've discussed today, I would argue, because the thing that worries me about what's coming, because these treatments are coming, psychedelic therapy is coming, so we've got the evidence for MDMA, meaning that treatments are coming online right now. There is also an enormous body of evidence now for psilocybin therapy from magic mushrooms. And again, overwhelming evidence that this can treat and help people. But with the kind of mental health difficulties that police officers have a much higher problem. So my concern when this does get licensed is that it will only be for the rich. And I would argue that because of all the reasons that we've heard today about the vulnerabilities of police and the impending worsening of the situation, that actually cops should be at the front of the queue. Absolutely be at the front of the queue, because how can our good cops do their job in looking after the community if they're not well themselves? So when this comes, we need to be arguing that cops need to be at the front of the queue. Absolutely. So in order to do that, I'm part of a group of people who will trying to do that with journalists and Google it. There's lots of journalists who have been speaking about this already that we've provided interviews for. But also, the drivers are going to need to be those police leaders. So, okay, you've already half answered this, and part of the answer is that it's inconsistent at the moment. Well, assuming that we had an agreement, a policy between the chiefs, the police chiefs, how do we make this happen politically?
So again, it goes back to the relationship in the UK, particularly in Wales, around police and crime commissioners. And again, recognising whilst they've got a role to play in terms of holding the force to account, it's actually a chief constable's decision about looking after their people. Again, accepting the police and crime commissioner or mayors obviously will give the money to the chief constable to deliver the service, and that in itself will be a sticking point if it has to be funded by the force. What I would argue again is it goes back to the responsibility of other policing bodies, i.e. the College of Policing, Oscar Kilo, which is now housed within the College of Policing, which again are set up to support individuals. Again, the work with the staff associations, the conversation about how they can help at the same time. But it's for me to now get in, firstly, that common understanding of the problem we're trying to deal with, Neil, and the urgency of what we're trying to deal with. And if I'm very honest, Federation colleagues, Neil, will be able to articulate that really well with the amount of people being in medical retirement significantly. Colleagues here from training will be able to tell the issues regarding retention and the issues coming back from some newer officers, our future leaders, which is really important to remember. But ultimately for me it goes back to, we've got to get firstly that common understanding across those bodies to say, look, there is a need to act. I think some won't necessarily the detail, but they recognise the urgency. If you speak to the Commissioner of the Met in a minute, the retention, he will certainly say is there a need to do some action around it. But also it goes back to and accepting the rules of the bit about cost, but just think how much it's costing policing and communities at the minute from what's happening at the moment. And if the situation will get worse, it's going to cost even more. So, as Chris has touched on, Sacco touched on Irel, this might not be for everybody, but it should be an option in the toolbox to support those that need help. And I think my point around it would be, and an action taken from today really is, that conversation with those bodies, if it's not happening, it needs to start happening with the evidence, and if nothing else, to start that conversation without leaving it too late. It's now authorised and regulated, and you start the conversation, which is too late. Policing takes time to make a decision, as you know very well.
Yeah. So
we need to start people thinking about that decision, and we also need to think about some of those people in decision-making positions now might not be here in 12 months, they may have left. So it's who else is coming through that we need to influence as well.
Great, so some of the things you just said there, I'll pick up on them really interesting, because you pointed out different actors in this, and that made me think that, yeah, what we need to be doing here is building a coalition of every interested party. So it's not just down to chiefs, it's not just down to the Federation, although I think the Federation, as time moves on, will be a very key influencer in this regard, not just to the higher level advocacy, but also amongst the troops themselves, because there's going to need to be some destigmatising going on here, but also the institutions that train police. So, and part of this, the reason for this event today was to start to build that coalition. And Chris and I have already begun to design packages where we can come to each individual force and start talking about this and training on this. And we also have some early development in actual system design. So, for example, if a coalition does want to argue that we need this, the questions will be, well, okay, well, how do you do that then? And so we're sort of getting ahead of those questions already, but we will need other people's input. We will need that two-way conversation. So thank you very much for that, Jason. If you're kind enough to pass it to Laura. So I made a nod to the Federation influencing their membership. How do you think this will go down with this thinking? Just not, and I'm not talking about the wellness thing. I've not even got to the wellness consideration yet. Just the idea of using MDMA treatment, MDMA therapy, and also in the future psilocybin therapy. How do you think that will play out actually within the police training structures and also with the troops you're training?
It's a very good question. One that I don't know 100% have the answer to. The big thing with policing is we don't like change. We don't like any sort of change. So any new thinking is one that's going to be met with a lot of resistance, a lot of questions. But the evidence that's been brought forward today it can't be ignored.
Yeah.
You know, why wouldn't we be looking for new ways? Because the old ways aren't working. And the more we explore it, the more research that's done around the subject, then the more we will know and be able to be informed going forward and with our new recruit. I think it's me. With our new recruits, instill it from the beginning. You know, that options are there, that destigmatise it, and make it part of one of the many things that we can offer within occupational health and support therapies.
Absolutely. Now you say that policing doesn't like change, and you're right. I mean, many big institutions are resistant to change, but there's no one quite as conservative, small c conservative as a bunch of cops. So yeah, that is true. But I think Jason made a very important point that we need to be, within policing we always need to be focusing on the evidence. But the evidence here is powerful, and one thing we haven't done here actually is to make a comparison between the efficacy of these innovative treatments compared with what's gone before. You know, we know many psychiatrists who said there's been a complete drought in any kind of psychiatric development, new treatments, in 60 years. It's been the same. There's been no development. There's been no improvement in treatment. So you could, you know, CBT therapists might shout at me for this if they're listening, you know, but many psychiatrists say there have been no development, and in comparison, the results are dramatic, as Chris has just said. Now the thing is, there is an underground. There is always an underground. You know, much as the United Nations once requested that we try and get a drug-free world, funnily enough, there isn't. And this has created an underground culture of all sorts of different types of drug use. And as the psychedelic renaissance has happened, or revolution, as I think perhaps we should describe it, there has been a growing underground culture of people seeking help to look after their mental health by going places where it's legal. Now, I have spoken to many of these underground therapists, and many of them have told me that they are looking after police officers. And I spoke to a particular chap who provides legal psilocybin therapy in the Netherlands. He started off providing it only for military veterans, but he has had an increasing number of cops, and mostly from the UK. And obviously we're lacking in some academically relevant evidence, but there is a large underground growth of data as to the benefits of that happening. I've even spoken to underground therapists who's looking after cops in the underground in the UK. Now that should, for one, make it clear, again, with some more evidence, that this is needed and that people are seeking help. And I spoke to one cop who said, well, you know, I'd rather be illegally well than legally dead. Because as we've said at the start of today, PTSD is a serious illness, one that you might not survive. And so this is growing. So this, to me, adds to the urgency, because there is a concern here that we will normalise the underground use of drugs which is essentially illegal. We need to get ahead of this for a variety of reasons, from a police leadership point of view, perhaps. But just to add some emphasis to that, if you don't mind talking about this, Jane, I believe that you have previously had PTSD.
Yes, I had PTSD completely unrelated to my police experience, would be refreshing. So I had it before, and I managed to, as far as I'm concerned, cure that PTSD by going to Peru and taking a psychedelic substance. And I observed exactly what you just said. So the people that you meet there are people from the military, a lot of US veterans. You have people from law enforcement, and you have a lot of women with severe complex trauma. And there's most certainly sort of as Sarka was saying as well, that there's a generational element, I think, to it as well. For me, interesting enough, there was a generational element that came up as well. And so it is already happening, but the resources that are needed in order to go there, I was very, very fortunate, because there's a huge amount of money that is involved. But also, if you work in the military or the police, I did not at the time. If someone finds out what you're up to and what you do, you might lose your job. So we have people who are taking it on themselves to make themselves well and taking huge risks to do so. And at the moment, we are actually sort of working against them. So I think that we need to talk about this a lot more. And I'm quite happy to talk about my experience. I talk about it really openly. I make very clear when my students ask me about it, so like, I'm not advertising that this is a magic bullet and that anyone should do it. This needs to be done in a place that knows what they're doing. There were very, very strict guidelines. There was a very, very thorough medical check, a diet that you had to follow before and after when I did this. I'm not saying we should all go to Peru and get high, which is how it often sort of like gets interpreted. That would be a terrible idea. Now, something that's happening in Peru is because it's an unregulated market. So you've got the ayahuasca tourism and sort of things like that. So I think, like I said, it's really, really crucial that we sort of get in front of this, because there's a lot of ideas floating around what this is that it is not. But the benefits that are there, I mean, obviously I'm just one example, but I can hand on heart say I don't think I would be alive, and I don't think I would be here today if I hadn't had that opportunity. And I don't think it is fair that it is denied people who are desperate, who are struggling. And in the case of police officers who are struggling because they've tried to help other people. So we absolutely need to do something about this.
Yeah, that's very well put, Jen. I mean, that brings us back to like what Jason said. There's a moral imperative here. We have people who are trying to do their best to look after other people in their community, and we are preventing them from using evidence-based potential solutions for many of them. Do you want to add any comment to that, Laura? I'm not sure.
I think he said the ones eloquently.
Okay, so we know these things are coming, and there's a risk because it's growing on the underground. It is growing. And as I've said, Chris and I are helping to actually design the systems of how these might work. But personally, rather than cops seeking out underground therapists, I'd rather they went to Flint's House or some of the other institutions which actually provides help for police. And I think that's the space, that's the kind of space that they should exist. So I think that we should probably open it up to questions on that, unless Chris, you think there's anything we should add to that? I think it's definitely a point for questions. Do we have a mechanism for online ones, or is it just going to be the people in the room?
No one has asked the question so far, so
All right.
I'll
Okay.
see if it pops up in the chat. So.
Okay, so those people listening, if you do want to ask a question, you can send it. But I suspect we're not going to be short of questions of people in the room. So be patient with me because we only have that microphone. Our planning, my apology. So just bear with me. I'll bring the microphone to you and I'll carry it to the appropriate person to answer.
There's one question on the chat below there. Go down. That's the question. Yeah.
So let's have a look at the question.
I can read it if you want.
Police treatment centres nationally run
very well reviewed 2-week psychological wellbeing courses, usually over 2 weeks. They include counselling, holistic therapies, learning individual coping strategies. I think all police officers should be encouraged to go and get paid leave to do so before they become ill, maybe 2 to 3 years into their career. Less expensive than losing so many police officers. What does the panel think? And that comes from
Could you do me a favour, just paraphrase that, so for the audience outside?
So I think what the questioner is saying, I think it's Penny from Great Manchester Police, is that there are already programmes that exist that actually can intervene and help people, to maintain wellness. So how, I guess she's asking, how do we allow people to get more access to that? So instead of taking mental, because I think in the Police Federation report, it was identified that quite a few people actually take leave for mental health reasons. So if they have to do that, can they actually then go somewhere and get something which is going to help them, is really what the question is about.
So I didn't raise it in my first point, but there has been some progress made, so it's without question, in terms of firstly trying to understand the problem that we're facing. The issue though is, in this area, this space, there isn't. And that's not because people are not interested, because it goes back to prioritisation, resources and everything else with it. So certainly from what I see at the moment, because of firstly the problem we're trying to address, we're getting a better understanding. We're getting a better understanding and urgency around it. It's an ideal time to be having that conversation with those that are leading them areas of work about how does this fit into an option in terms of supporting individuals that need this help. The reality for us is, as you touched on there, Neil, individuals will find different ways of coping with their needs, won't they? Whether that be illicit, through regulated processing, everything else around it. And that's a really good point, the alcohol issue. So my point around it would be is there's enough evidence and insight of what we know. With this new insight, actually gives that impetus to be thinking differently about what we need to do, and that we need to do it quite quickly. Recognising again, as colleagues touched on, it's not for everybody, but it's an option that can be considered for those that would probably get the best benefit from it.
Just to add something on there, and we didn't really touch on this in any detail because the audio with Sarko was so difficult, but there is a lot of knowledge now about what it does physiologically and how you can actually address that and how to maintain that. I mean, people talk about mindfulness, and maybe that seems a bit out there for people, but actually, whilst the Western medical model for a long time rejected what Eastern medicine was talking about how you regulate yourself, about energy, that is now being understood to be valid. So there is a kind of process whereby if you are continually under stress, you end up what you call locked or dysregulated in the front. So the human body moves through different stages. So when we're excited or stressed, we move into the front. We become active. We become stressed. That's normal. It's helpful. Okay. And when we want to relax or we want to sleep, then we move towards the back and we kind of relax and sit back. But those different modes actually affect the way that we think. So when we're in stressed mode, it's more difficult for us to access our thinking capacities. And actually, if you do too much and you get stuck and dysregulated in that mode, that's when it becomes really dangerous, because you're actually on hyperdrive and hypervigilance. So you can actually teach yourself to regulate and to come back into what we call, and Svelko talked about heart opening, but basically it's where you're regulated and you're calm. So that mechanism about calming is important, and I think that's what they're talking here, those kind of basic physiological coping strategies, because the body affects the mind affects the body. And you can use the mind to try and bring the body back into balance, which will then help how the mind functions. And also, I mean, I know probably there are a lot of police officers who are physically active, but we've talked about doing this in the past, but there's a session that we want to run called Everybody Loves a Foot Chase, okay? And the point of that is that if you're a response officer and you're blue lighting to things all the time, but then you get there and you've got to suddenly calm yourself and act rationally. I mean, we were on myself when we arrived there, we arrived through Birmingham New Street Station, and we saw some police officers, and they were at the gate, and they were suddenly completely losing it, and they're swearing at them and telling them that they didn't want to play a ticket. No, you go free, why don't I go free? Really, really having a go, and I'm thinking, that's a really hard job, because I know I will be going back to them. And that police officer has to not access that, okay? And that is a really, really hard job. So, and having that load of the stress coming in and then having to try to push it to the side, you have to be able to let it out. So it's also about, I think people have advised, get out of your squad car, do some exercise, discharge that energy so it doesn't build up. Just acknowledging that this is an acknowledged physiological process. You're going there and you're charging up all this stress and it doesn't go anywhere. So you have to acknowledge that and then do something with it, and that will kind of discharge it and dissipate some of it. So that knowledge is there, it's known. We know that happens physiologically, and that's something that people could be made aware of about how to maintain and manage.
Is there any other comments on that? Shall I get the next question? If I just chip into something there. As you've probably just gathered there, Chris and I have been designing sections of a conference for a while. So this is the beginning of many events, and when we do have the full conference, we will send all of you invitations, and one of the sessions will be called Everyone Loves a Foot Chase.
Yeah.
Lee, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure.
First of all, Neil and Chris and the team, thank you for today. Thank you to all the speakers, you've been brilliant. And Sarko, wow, let's get you in charge of the FDA tomorrow, right? Two things spring to mind. Line managers, we keep talking about people going to their line managers for support. What support are we giving the line managers and what training are we giving them? And then if you get up to, say, Chief Constable level, where do they go? What's their route of support? And linked to that, there's sort of root of stigma is that we're all talking today about some fantastic interventions. How do we get more people, especially in the police, to come forward with their problems when there's so much peer pressure to not to? We talked earlier about presenteeism and people coming to work because they feel they should, regardless of the illness. How do we actually get them to identify themselves in the first place, confidentially of course, before we can even start talking about the interventions?
I've said this many times, I'll continue to say it, the most important ranks leaders are sergeants and inspectors. So if we don't invest in those, we're just literally letting everybody down at all the levels. So I know there's been a lot of work done nationally. So the College of Police have done work around sergeants and inspectors. There's some of that still coming out now. I know a lot of forces, and West Midlands would probably be an example where they've spent time and effort in trying to support those sergeants and inspectors. The challenge though is when you look back to reality, actually a lot of those that are performing the sergeant inspectors are not the substantive sergeant inspectors because they're doing other things, and therefore you've got, again, very inexperienced individuals trying to be a sergeant, trying to be an inspector, some may argue doing better than their substantives, but the reality is they're trying to help, and the reality is they probably have less training, less exposure and everything else around it. So there is efforts around it. I think the bit goes back to what do we want from the sergeant inspectors? And again, if you look at, and there was always the debate around the degree entry into policing, when you look at the investment went into the new starters, what's happening with the sergeants, inspectors, chief inspectors, superintendents, all the way up the chain, where actually they're not getting that investment. And the reality is therefore they are doing what they see to be best, or what they are seeing others which they believe to be best in terms of delivery. And the reality is they only know what they know. They're not having this conversation, they've not got the space to have a conversation about what we need to do differently. And that's where I'm hoping a lot of my previous chief officer colleagues are getting that space to start thinking what do we need to do differently, because the reality is it's a real critical issue, critical time for policing at the minute, not just in terms of public trust and confidence, but staff confidence as well. We talk about continued professional development. I don't like the abbreviation of it because it goes back to CPS, but it's about continued professional support. What are we doing around that continued support, and that's for sergeants as well.
If I can just add a little addendum to that question. As trainers, do you think actually getting those sergeants and inspectors into your training on this topic, do you think that would help? Bringing the actual institution back to the training?
Absolutely, and we regularly invite our connected forces in to come and see what training we do. Alongside that, I've seen some great leadership training, and I agree, there's a lot of work going into that. It's just going to take time for that to then filter through. But I think it is key for your sergeants, your inspectors, every level really, to have the same trauma-informed communication training that new recruits are getting. And it should be from top down, everyone is on the same page. We expect our officers to go out and deliver trauma-informed service, but how can they do that when we're not doing it in-house? So it's really key to really expand on that training.
Just on the stigma issue, and again, I'm speaking to colleagues from West Midlands, because there's lots of new starters, lots of new energy, in itself, that might be an opportunity where people are more willing to be open because it's creating that culture within it. So again, we've got to use that opportunity. Whilst it brings all the issues and risks that we talked about already today, actually it does bring some opportunity to get people to be willing to share and learn from it as well. But I'll go back to, again, the most influence I had on my service was my sergeant and my tutor. I always give them the praise or ultimately, depending how people see it, the way I've got to. But the reality is they can have such an influence on the new stars coming through the organisation. If you've got a good sergeant and a really good tutor who you keep contact with all your service, no matter which level you get to, the reality is they can really shape your service as well, and they're the ones that look out for you. All your service looking out for you.
So just one to touch on that. So I was having a conversation about a lady called Sarah Jane Only. So she's a doctor and she's done a lot of work on something called emotional labour, so about police culture and mental health. And she said to me that based on some discussions that she's had, it looks like one of the most important factors for prevention of risk or lowering of risk is the initial response of the sergeant to that new police officer's first instant. So if they return to the station and they're taken aside and they're talked about and say, look, this is difficult, and actually normalising the fact that it's difficult, you know, that you are human, you will feel this way, that happens. That acceptance, that actually feeling, you know, like you feel after you've seen something horrible is a natural response, can actually create a layer of kind of like, okay, well that's the emotional culture of this organisation. They've accepted me in the way that I've responded, and so I'm less likely to then suppress that and then have problems later down the line. So it's kind of a reinforcement of what you were saying around the evidence base. Also, it's very early days, but it's kind of anecdotally pointing towards that being a key factor around actually where your risk of developing, you know, serious mental health issues later down the line.
I think another point that links to that is recruitment. I think we need to make sure that the right people can get into the police and that we limit the amount of wrong people going in. And obviously as a result of the shortage, the austerity and the uplift, I think the recruitment process for some forces is so people have gone in without interview. We know that the vetting is absolutely something that needs reviewing. And if you haven't got the right people in, then that has an impact on the culture. So I think it comes back to that as well. And obviously on our degree, the degree is accepted by police force, but they still need to go through the process. And I think there needs to be more focus on how do we sort of like look for positive signs that someone is emotionally intelligent, that they will be supportive. So rather than having sort of tick box process of sort of like we don't need anyone who's has a lived experience of sort of mental health in the last 2 years. Because you're potentially excluding also someone who has had traumatic growth who can go in. So I think we need to completely rethink the recruitment process.
Yeah, I hadn't really adequately thought of that, to be honest. So with that in mind, for the future conference, Jen, will you help us design a session on that particular?
Well done.
That would be really, really useful. So, yes.
This kind of follows on from the point that you were making. It was just to get the panel's views on whether there should be psychological screening as a point at the point of entry, but then obviously regular psychological screening, not necessarily to prevent people who have got psychological issues if they can be managed from entering the service, but more so that we're aware of them and that the risk assessments and things can be put in place.
I've got an answer to that, but who wants to go first? No? Yeah? Okay, well it brings to mind something which I suppose I forgot to mention earlier on. There's another issue to consider here. There is a comorbidity with ADHD and PTSD, in that if you have ADHD you are more likely to get PTSD, you are also more likely to suffer from a more severe form of it. And there is evidence to support that statement, which means that in terms of evaluating somebody's health or neurodiversity, you have to be able to identify risks. I think your question was really alluding to the idea that if you have more information, you can be more targeted to look after people. I think that was the flavour of the question. It's a good question. But if you broaden that out to neurodiversity, I think you can also bring that you are also looking at considerations under the Equalities Act, because if you have a cohort of people who have identified as having more, who's needing more help, then you suddenly have a legal duty to actually have reasonable adjustments to look after that. And that is something that will raise its head. You know the way these things work. We've got a mental health crisis we're in the middle of it. We've acknowledged it's getting worse. These issues are coming. So I think it's a really good question to be actually focusing on individual needs, right? Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Luke from Cranstoun. A question, something I'm curious about, I suppose, is that when it comes to psychedelic treatment, I wonder if perhaps those who are kind of drug naive, who haven't used an illicit substance prior, or whose kind of worldview on drugs is strongly shaped by kind of stigma, etc., how likely they'd be to undertake what is a powerful drug experience. So, and within the context of this discussion, I'm specifically interested as to how that might be received within policing. So, the extent to which policing and officers are or are not, more or less drug naive than the general population. And thank you.
Anyone?
So,
I have an answer, but
so I suppose the first bit is, it goes back to understanding education and knowledge, isn't it, with it? So again, certainly if you looked at it from a chief officer perspective, it's about them understanding better. They're probably not as naive as we sometimes make out. It all boils back down to various political decision making about what's the consequences of me supporting that, my force supporting that, and am I going to create some attention on me when I'm already getting lots of attention for lots of other things, and actually I don't need to have that attention. So I think your point around it is there needs to be a level, doesn't there? There's got to be a standard level of understanding, which goes back to investment in knowledge, training, continued professional development, continued professional support for those individuals. But the reality goes back to, let's be honest, this is with consent of the individual, so we're not going to force someone to tell this. The reality is it's being more informed, and again given that option to do it, when actually, as Neil said, there's already demand. If it's underground, there's demand for this. People have got a knowledge base already. Let's get it on top. Let's make sure it addresses the stigma issue. Let's make sure it's more available to other people, and therefore the individual. Let's we feel a lot about the families and friends of the individual. We've not even mentioned them today, but the impact it has on them as well. But just important, the wider impact and positive impact it has on communities as well.
There's a really good article, I think it was a blog on the Federation website in 2019, and it was one of the bits of writing from the Police Federation in response to the study which I referred to from 2018. And in that blog it made the point that we've been on a long journey in educating officers and police leaders as to the need of personal protection in personal armour and the various ways we look after, especially body armour. I remember being personally resistant to wearing body armour when it came out. I remember that. I remember it was a difficult cultural thing to adapt to. But we do have a duty to look after people, so we provide protective equipment and we mandate the wearing of it. We are at the beginning of the same kind of journey in understanding the impact on our mental health. And whereas in that blog it made a very, very good point that we're used to doing it for our body, it's time to start doing it for our mind. And there was a cultural change for that. There can be a cultural change for this as well. Yeah. Let's see the time. Is this meant to be 30 minutes?
It's 6 o'clock.
It's 40. So yeah, are we winding it up there? Have we got time for last comments?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so apparently, as I've just been reminded, we now have to stop. But as a lot of people who know me, I can just keep talking all night. But I'm going to pass to the panellists just to have a few last words, and then we'll wind it up. Jen, any last words?
And the only thing that just sort of sprung to my mind in response to your question is that I think sort of what I observed is that where you have a lot of sort of judgments and ideas sort of at training school, when you then talk to people a couple of years later and they've worked with county lines and they've seen the knock-on effects on everything else. I think most officers, once they have a number of years of experience and they've dealt with that, they are going to be much more open to that. because drugs are so central to so many of the issues that police are dealing with, and officers who have to go to those and can see those connections, I think will understand that much better than maybe we would think.
I suppose my kind of reflection is more about my personal kind of situation and what I've seen happen to my partner and what such a struggle she's had along the way. And I think in her times of crisis where there've been suicidal thoughts, there've been incidents where we've not known if she's going to come through it, if she'd have had an option like this available to her, there's not a doubt in my mind that it would have been something we'd have sought. Because when you're at that point where you're considering my life isn't worth living, then something has got to be done. And if there's an opportunity through psychedelics, then it's something that I know she would reach out for, because why not?
Two for me. First one goes back to this is about people. We have a legal moral duty to look after our people, and that includes not just internally but externally as well. And again, the insight and personal stories, again, the more we can make of those, which is a real sad having to make them stories, but the writing more we use them for the evidence of what we need to do is the better. The second one, and hopefully colleagues upon this, every force needs to invest in Cranstoun in reality, because them little bits, them reducing demand, for helping officers do the things, that meaningful issue actually does make a real difference. And again, some of the testimonies on there, and there's other testimonies the team could show you as well.
Yeah. So yeah, just carrying on from Jason, I guess my point as an external person is that I just see it as a whole system thing. So it's about changing the nature of the work. It's about the awareness of the issue. So we don't want people. I would prefer people not to even need MDMA therapy, right? Why do they even need it? So, but awareness goes a long way. Acceptance of the fact that it does happen and that it's normal. Trauma responses are normal. What can you do to manage it day to day? And creating that culture of kind of openness and vulnerability amongst leaders, so they can put that out and say, yeah, I'm actually struggling too. And that goes a massive way to allowing giving people beneath the permission to also go, yeah, you're struggling, I'm glad you've admitted it because I am too. It's remarkable how transformative that is. And then, yeah, you know, actually it is unfortunately a fact of the job that some people will develop serious mental health issues, and shouldn't they have access to those treatment options that everyone else will have access to, and people around the world will be having access to soon, so why shouldn't people in UK police officers be at the front of that queue? So.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone in the room, but also everyone watching and listening, wherever you may be. Please bear in mind the thing that I started the day with is that this is ongoing. This is the beginning of a journey. Chris and I have been working hard on this for the last 3 years. It's coming up to. We will be doing future events. We will be doing a large conference. Please support us in that. If you agree with us that this needs action and we need to keep having this conversation, then support our future events, bring more people to it. And also, when we ask you for access to get more data, please help us with that. There is work that needs to be done. We have a lot of evidence, but more is better. So thank you very much.